Today's topic that we are going to discuss is the rise of the Afrikaner nationalism. We are going to know that how in the southern Africa the Afrikaner nationalism went to its high position. So when we talk about the background of the topic, the history of Afrikaners begin with the first European settlement by the Dutch in a place known as the Cape Town. So when we talk about the where this Cape Town is, so this is the southern part of Africa, and this whole part is known as the Cape Town, and this point is known as the Cape Point. Cape's early Dutch-speaking settlers gradually evolved a distinct variant of that language, and the people who settled in the southern Africa, they started to evolve their language, and these people were known as Africans, and they themselves became known as Afrikaners or Boers. By various strategies, they took over more land in that area. The Cape was under the Dutch control until approximately in 1820, when the British sent their own settlers and eventually took over the Cape Colony, which then belonged to Britain. These Afrikaners did not want to be under British control. In the 1830s, they took the collective decision to leave the Cape Colony. So all these Dutch-speaking people who settled in the southern Africa and became the Afrikaners or the Boers, so they took a decision to leave that area and move in the upper part of the southern Africa. So they took a decision to leave the Cape Colony and move into the interior of southern Africa and establish their own land. This would became to known as the Great Track. So they covered a part of land, and that known as the Great Track. So those people started from here. This is Cape Colony. They move upward. This is the Orange Free State. Then they went to the Natal. Then they went to the Transvaal, and this whole uh, this whole picture depicts the Great Track of the Dutch-speaking people who settled in the southern Africa. Now, when we come to the next point, they would then be free from British control. So these people thought that if they will leave the Cape Colony and move into the interior of the southern Africa, they would be free from the British control. Over time and through various strategies, such new lands and created their own republic state called Orange Free State and Southern Africa Republic known as Transvaal. White Afrikaners living in the Boer Republic of the Transvaal and Orange Free State developed a strong sense of Afrikaner national loyalty and resisted British control and influence. They also believed that Afrikaners had a special history as a chosen people chosen by God during the Great Trek of the 1830s. At this point in history, the Afrikaners were not really united. So when they moved into the interior of the southern Africa, they established two states that were free of the British rule. First was the Orange Free State, and second was the Transvaal. But still, till that point, the Afrikaners were not really united. At first, the British supported this, but when gold was discovered in Transvaal, their own desire for the land grew. It was the inevitable that there would be conflict between the British and the Afrikaners. This would become known as the South African War. So, when all the Dutch speaking people or all the Boers and the Afrikaners settled into the interior part of the South Africa, British came to know that gold was discovered in Transvaal. So they started to interfere in the free states of these Afrikaners. Now, the South African War that occurred from 1899 to 1902. They forced the Afrikaners into unity. Afrikaners took up arms in the war against the British. The Afrikaners were defeated and were very upset by this, especially of how Afrikaner women and children were treated in the British concentration camp. Britain was keen to compromise with the Afrikaners after the war, and one of the ways they did this was to create the Union as a self-governing country, although it was part of the British Empire. Now, when we come to the next point, that is strengthening of Afrikaner nationalism. When the British British started a war against these Afrikaners, so these Afrikaners started to unite and they formed the Afrikaner nationalism. In the newly created union, the Afrikaner wanted a greater say in what they saw as their country. They formed the National Party in 1914 to promote white Afrikaner interest and was led by JBM Hasdog, a former Boer general and Afrikaner politician. In 1924, the National Party won the elections and Hasdog became prime minister. So this man, known as the Hasdog, he started to form a party known as the National Party in 1914 to promote white Afrikaners, and he also became the prime minister and won the election. The National Party government began to immediately take steps to protect Afrikaners. Afrikaners was recognized as an official language. A South African flag was adopted in 1928, which included the flags of the former Boer republics. The government also introduced policies to protect white workers and gave them preferences for work in government departments. So this National Party worked for the white Afrikaners. They also gave them work in the government departments. They fought for their republic. So somehow this party was working for the white Afrikaners. During the depression in the 1930s, the government department during the depression in the 1930s, the government department made special effort to help poor Afrikaners who were referred to as poor whites. The Afrikaners government stressed their shared Afrikaner identity. Now, when we come to the Afrikaner nationalism in the 1930, Afrikaner identity and Afrikaner nationalism grew stronger. Afrikaners were united by their own special history, language, and culture. They placed a great emphasis on history as a means of creating an Afrikaner identity. Afrikaner nationalists established several organizations to promote these aims. Now we come to a point, that is Boer Bond. What is this Boer Bond? So FAK, Federation of Afrikaners Culture organization, was established by the Boer Bond to support Afrikaner cultural activities. It makes sure that Afrikaner cultural activities promoted nationalism. So they started to promote cultural activities, and their main point was to promote the Afrikaner nationalism so that people can be united and they can form their own republic. Afrikaners Talen, Culvertring, Afrikaners language and cultural organization, Afrikaner cultural organizations such as the Wood Trackers and the Nudulpliga. The rest of the countries was also affected when an African's anthem, Die Stem, became the national anthem. So at this point, the Afrikaans anthem, Die Stem, became the national anthem. Now, when we talk about the significance of the Great Trek for Afrikaner nationalism, what was the main role of the Great Trek in the Afrikaner nationalism? In 1938, the Boer Bond organized Sanitary Trek, the E-Face, to commemorate the Great Trek of 100 years before. Afrikaners from the different countries joined procession of Volkswagen journeying to Pretoria, where thousands gathered to witness the founding of the Woodtracker Monument. So at this time of the Great Trek, they also find a monument which is also known as the Woodtracker Monument. So when we see the picture of this Woodtracker Monument, so here is the picture of this Woodtracker Monument which these Afrikaners found out when they were doing the Great Trek. From this pride, the Volkswagen Guard was performed at, which was supposed to be another cultural organization but as became extremely political. All of this organization and commemorations promoted the idea that white Afrikaners were a unique and special folk people with their own language, religion, and history that needed to be promoted and defended. The National Party and the Afrikaner cultural and economic organizations deliberately promoted the idea of white Afrikaner unity. This was stressed especially through the Afrikaans language, the Dutch Reformed Church, and political loyalty to the National Party. Now, the next point which comes is the idea of white Afrikaner unity and difference from other South Africans was evident in that how these Afrikaners people united instead of the other peoples who were living in South Africa. First point was the education. White Afrikaners were deliberately taught that being white made them superior. So these people used to think if they are white, they are superior to the black people who live in the southern Africa. The history which was taught was biased and glorified Afrikaners' achievement only. This became known as Christian national education. The Afrikaner newspaper and publication by the national purse, nationalist press, also promoted these ideas among the work. Now, the next point is the labor. White Afrikaners workers were encouraged to join Afrikaner trade unions such as the Spoor Bond for railway workers in order to protect the white workers. So somehow these peoples were making the idea that the white Africans are superior to the black Africans who live in the southern Africa. The next point come is the religion. White Afrikaners was discouraged from belonging to foreign or English dominated churches such as the Anglican Methodist or Catholic churches. Instead, loyal Afrikaners were expected to belong to the Dutch Reformed Church, which supported the National Party. Economy. Separate Afrikaner financial institutions were established such as Wokas Bank and Sonlam Building Society. This was to give Afrikaners greater opportunities in a capitalist economy that was dominated by English-speaking white people. A reading that phone Act of Rescue Fund was formed to support new Afrikaner business. These ideas of the affirmative economic action and a sense of racial supremacy formed the background of the policy of apartheid. After World War II, more white Afrikaner voters joined the General National Party, purified national party that had been established in the 1930s to promote a purer form of Afrikaner nationalism. This party was voted into power in the 1948 election. The leader of this party and new government was D.F. Malan. Afrikaner nationalism had trumped, and now there was a government in power dedicated to breaking ties with Britain, advancing the economic and political power of white Afrikaners through affirmative action, introducing a strict system of segregation designed to preserve and extend white domination. So this was the rise of Afrikaner nationalism and the important points related to it. Somehow these were the short notes, so I hope you got it, guys.